Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. I've thoroughly enjoyed the experience already. In fact, my daughter, Layal, is here, my beautiful daughter. Wave your hand. Say hi. There she is. She's in the back. She accompanied me, and it's one of the rare privileges. I travel a lot for ministry, and it's one of the rare privileges I have when one of my kids gets to come with me and just be part of the experience. We love coming to the western side of the state. I'm from the eastern side of the state, and it's like a totally different country over here. Talk about unity and diversity in the Sunday school session, and it seems to me Michigan is by itself a union of contrasts, all by itself because it's so different on the other side of the state. So it's always wonderful to be here with you. I want to open up my talk today on Is Christianity Delusional with a story. There was a guy, he was walking down the street, and he walks by this travel agency, and he sees a sign in the window that says, River Cruise, $100. River Cruise, $100. What? So he walks in and he's thinking, there's no way this could possibly be the real price. This is so cheap. He walks in and the guy behind the counter says, absolutely, sir, full River Cruise, $100. The guy says, sold. Puts his $100 bill on the counter. Bam! He gets hit over the head with a club. Boom! Knocked unconscious. Later on, he sort of wakes up and he finds himself floating in this barrel down this river. And he looks over and he sees another guy in a barrel floating on the river, and he's holding his head too and kind of rubbing it. And he goes, hey, is there lunch on this cruise? And the other guy says, there wasn't last year. Now, the second guy is the real punchline, isn't it? Because he was delusional. He had every reason to not trust the organizers or the people who are the crooks behind this little scam, but he trusted them anyway. He had every evidence to say that this is going to be a scam, yet there he was, floating down the river, expecting lunch this time. Many of the critics of belief in God in general, and Christianity in particular, think Christianity is kind of like this. That it's a persistent false belief in light of contrary evidence. In fact, Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous atheists, he wrote a book called The God Delusion. This is what he has to say about belief in God. He says, a delusion is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, especially as a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. God is a delusion and a pernicious delusion. When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from it, it is called religion. What do you really think, Richard? Don't pull any punches. Can this kind of thing be the real story behind Christianity, behind 2,000 years of an intellectual tradition that has given to us, things like the great works of art, the great scientists from Pascal to Newton to Faraday to all these big boys and these women who have contributed in such marvelous ways to our intellectual tradition? Is this what it really is? Can that be what it really is? Now, many agree with Richard on this. This book didn't sell a few copies. It sold millions of copies. Millions of copies. And Richard Dawkins is one of the most followed people in terms of Twitter and other things that you'll see out there. His stuff is not ignored hardly at all. This is a statement about a caricature of Christian faith, I believe. You see, this is stating that matters of faith, are better left to the emotions and these kind of things, and that the sciences and academic rigor and these kind of things, this is where the real answers lie, and we don't have to have matters of faith to understand the world. The weak-minded and those who need the crutch of belief, they can have their faith, but us who are serious about the world, we'll take science and other things, and this delusion, you can keep it to yourself. And in fact, I'm not even sure that Dawkins thinks you should keep it to yourself, because he thinks it's actually a pernicious delusion. It's one that actually has negative consequences in the world. And a lot of them want to eradicate it from the social atmosphere because they think it leads to bad things. And in fact, it has been abused over the course of the years, but so has non-belief as well. But this is a statement that faith is just wishful thinking, or it's delusional. Now the question is this, that everyone in this room, I think, needs to ask, and we can find the answers here. Is the Christian faith like this? Because yes, there are some measures of faith that are like that, just blind faith, believe something without any evidence for it, just believe something. But does the Bible tell us to believe that way? See, if it did, then Dawkins might have a point, at least an arguing point he can start from, that the Bible says believe things despite contrary evidence or no evidence at all. But the Bible doesn't actually say that. What it says, if you look at Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 11, it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. By the way, the first thing you need to recognize from this verse is that faith and hope aren't the same thing. People equate the two all the time. Oh, I hope this, or I have faith that this will happen, or I hope this will happen. They're different. If they weren't different, Paul wouldn't use both words in the same sentence. Faith is the substance of that which is hoped for. That word faith in the Greek has a lot of connotations. One of those connotations is, of course, trust. We trust things. It's an active trust. It's a trust based on what already has been done. Everybody in this room exhibits faith. I don't care if you're a Christian or an atheist or an agnostic or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Buddhist, whatever it is. There's a modicum of faith in your life. Everyone, almost everyone, is seated right now in this room. You all sat down in these pews having faith they would hold up your bulk. You all did. Did you test it? Do you mean those little weights they have and they just drop them and pick them up and drop them again? Yep, this is strong. I can sit here. You didn't do that, did you? You all likely drove here. Did you test your brakes before you got in your car? They could fail. You could die. You had faith in the brakes. Now, there's evidence to back that faith up, isn't there? Because you've sat in these pews before, or you've driven in cars, and you know that, based on statistics, cars' brakes don't tend to fail. But you don't know that this is the one time they might. By the way, I was the unfortunate recipient of, I put my faith in a certain chair in a certain public place, and it didn't live up to my expectations. Much to my chagrin, but the delight of everyone in the room. We all have faith. The question isn't, do you have faith or not? Faith is something everybody has. And the Bible says you have faith based on prior evidence. You won't find any place in the Bible, not one place, where the Bible actually tells you to have faith when there's no evidence or contradictory evidence that would suggest that God is not worthy of your faith. You won't find that anywhere in the Bible. The only place you can argue with it is when Jesus walks in, having been resurrected from the dead, and Thomas is there and says, I won't believe until I see the nail scars and the wounds. And Jesus shows them to him, and he says, blessed are you. He says, you believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe and who have not seen. You know what he's not saying? He's not saying that blind faith is better than actual faith that's verified. He's not saying that. He's saying that seeing is one way to believe. And this man, Thomas, had been with this group of men and women who had served the Lord Jesus and seen God move and do miracles through him for 3 years, and yet their testimony about his resurrection wasn't good enough. That was evidence. Testimony is, in fact, evidence, and it wasn't good enough. He says, Thomas, you need to see, but these men you've been spending your whole life with for 3 years, and these women who have told you these things, that's not good enough. You need to see still. Of course, what's interesting is that when his faith is rewarded, when Christ rewards Thomas's faith with the evidence, he shows it to him. What does Thomas do? He says, my Lord and my God. And history and tradition tells us that Thomas went to India and preached the gospel there. There's a shrine to him to this day. Evidence is the substance of evidence forms the substance of our faith so that we can have hope. Faith is trust. Hope is a positive expectation of a future event. You have a positive expectation of a future event or the fulfillment of a promise. Faith is trusting the one who made the promise based on what he has done. The Israelites were told to trust God because of what he did do, the 10 plagues onto Egypt. Then the parting of the Red Sea, the pillar of the cloud, and the pillar of the fire. They were given evidence of God's supernatural and divine power all the time. And so throughout the generations, they were constantly reminded of what God had done so they could trust what God will do. And the Christian faith is not based on, maybe this will happen, I hope and pray, and maybe, oh goodness, my emotions are stirred up within me. The Christian faith is uniquely a faith that says you can trust that what God will do is based on what Christ has done. And that's the resurrection of Jesus. So you're not told to believe blindly. You're not told to believe blindly. There's nowhere in the Bible where you'll find that. It is about trust, and each one of us does that. In fact, I shared this morning, Christianity is interesting because it makes a unique claim among other religious systems. Other religious systems say, trust the beauty or the wisdom of my teachings. Look how wonderfully written the Bhagavad Gita is of the Hindus. Look how beautiful the Quran is of the Muslims. Buddha said, look to my dharma and the wisdom of my teaching and all these things. And Jesus says, though he has beautiful words, though he has poetic statements, and that the Bible has all of these things put together, he says the foundation of why you should trust me is that when this body is destroyed, I will raise it up again. It's not a subjective matter, ladies and gentlemen. Either it happened or it didn't. It's either true or it's false. It's objectively testable, and we'll get into that later. So the question each one of us is faced with is not whether we have faith. That isn't the question. Everyone has faith. The question is whether or not the object of our faith is worthy of it. People say, Christianity is a crutch. Belief in God is just a crutch. You know what? We all have crutches. I always wanted to ask back to the person who says that, Christianity is just a crutch. I want to ask them back, and so what? What does that mean? Everyone has a crutch. We all have crutches of some kind. We all need to get help through life in some way. For some it's psychology, for some it's, science, whatever it is, and all these things put together are a way we can get through life. But the question isn't whether or not you need a crutch. The question is, what is your crutch made out of? Is it sturdy enough to stand up to the weight of the world? And the weight of the world is coming. Each one of us knows this to some degree. And the older we get, the more things press on us, and that crutch better be sturdy. So what I want to share is a few ways in which I think that Christianity is not delusional, but it actually, instead of flying in the face of contradictory evidence, has evidence that flows along with it, that supports the message of the Christian faith in particular. God, belief in God generally, and the Christian faith in particular. So I want to go through and say that the evidence of design makes faith in God reasonable. The evidence of the design of the universe and of the design of humanity itself. The first question is this. It's been asked over and over again. And a philosopher named Leibniz actually asked this question first. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all? Why does the universe exist? It's an important question. It's a profound question. And I think that science can give us clues as to the existence of the universe and how it works, but ultimately it can't tell you why it's here. That's a why question. It's a purpose question. It's not a question that science can definitively answer, but might give us clues as to why that might be. But the standard models of cosmology, in other words, the study of how we got here, how the universe itself got here, tell us, the Big Bang Theory, for example. Now, I know a lot of Christians get a little nervous when you use the word Big Bang, and they get kind of like, oh my goodness, Big Bang, no, that disproves God's existence. Actually, quite the opposite. What does the Big Bang Theory essentially tell us, the standard model of cosmology tell us? It tells us that all things, matter, energy, space, and time, all things that exist in the physical world or in the universe, matter, energy, space, and time, actually had a beginning in the finite past from a state of nothing, of not anything. You know what else tells you that? Genesis 1:1. It tells you that. That's a standard model. Now, for hundreds of years, or for decades at least before that, scientists believe in what's called the steady state theory of cosmology, that the universe was eternal. And then along come these upstart scientists who say, no, it had a beginning, and we can prove that through the way we can see the expansion of the universe happening, the various mathematical models. We can say that the universe had a beginning in the finite past. And it was the scientists who said, no, we can't have that. And they were railing against this for various scientific reasons, but really the reason was because they couldn't have a beginning, because the Bible says, in the beginning, God. There's that old joke that says, that scientists are climbing up the mountain of knowledge to find out the origins of the universe, only to find out that there's been theologians at the top of the mountain for thousands of years, saying, when did you guys get here? Now, it's not against science at all. That isn't my point at all. Science and theology actually overlap in so many beautiful ways, and the Bible tells us about the beginnings of the universe. And in fact, it's been saying the universe had a beginning for years before science was actually telling us this and confirming it. But what is the source of that universe? Matter, energy, space, and time. What is the source of matter, energy, space, and time? It's got to be a being, or some kind of a cause at least, that is immaterial, not matter, has enormous power, more than the combined energy of the entire universe, a spaceless being, and a timeless, or at least eternal being. Because if matter, energy, space, and time didn't exist at one point, the cause has to be able to create matter, energy, space, and time. What does an immaterial, enormously or infinitely powerful, spaceless, and eternal being sound like to you? There's a signature there. There's a legacy right in science, and you can see it in the fine-tuning of the universe. What do I mean by fine-tuning of the universe? Scientists have known this for quite some time now. There are a number of properties in the universe that show us that these properties are finely tuned. In other words, the initial conditions of the universe, the way it began and expanded, there are certain properties that are so finely tuned, so narrow in their ranges of possibility they could be to allow for life, that if they were off by a cosmic hair's breadth, it's just the smallest of degrees, no life is possible anywhere in the universe at all. Stephen Hawking himself, one of the world's most famous atheists, at least an agnostic, who is a theoretical physicist, of course, and everyone knows who he is, he estimated that if the rate of the universe's expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball. No life possible. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of the Big Bang's low entropy condition, or the state of organization of the energy in the beginning of the universe, that the odds of it being the way it needed to be for life to exist is 1 on the order of 1 out of 10 to the 10th power, that's 1 out of 10 times itself 10 times, then that number times itself 123 more times. I can't even write that out for you. If I were to write that number out with the zeros, I would die before I was done. Not of fatigue, just time, old age. That's how big and unbelievable that is. That's what leads people like Stephen Hawking himself to say that the universe and the laws of physics seem to have been specifically designed for us. If any one of about 40 physical qualities had more than slightly different values, life as we know it could not exist. Either atoms would not be stable, or they wouldn't combine into molecules, or the stars wouldn't form heavier elements, or the universe would collapse before it could develop, and so on. And he goes on to say this: the remarkable fact is that these values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. And he says that in The Brief History of Time, his book, The Brief History of Time. Now, he's not a believer in God. In his book, The Grand Design, he argues that there is no grand design. But he acknowledges these facts, that the universe seems finely tuned for the existence of life here, that all these properties, he says there's 40, we're finding new ones all the time. There are new properties that are showing these things all the time. That choices look like they were being made. That these conditions of the universe that allow for life, they could have been different. They actually could have been much different, but they're not. And if any one of these were different, no life possible. So it looks like choices were made. Do we know that for sure? Of course we don't. We could never know that for sure with 100% certainty, but we don't know anything with 100% certainty. Again, we have a matter of faith, don't we? In all kinds of ways. But what do you see? When you look at an intelligence, what do you look for? Choices being made. How do you tell an intelligence arranged the rocks the way they did or sent the signal the way they did? Is because that signal could have been different or those rocks could have been different, but they're ordered in a specific way that conveys a message of some kind. Choices were made. And the way the universe is organized so that we could be here suggests that choices were made. Not randomly, not by accident, but on purpose. So the universe itself screams out that there's a designer. But the DNA molecule, when you look to the telescopes, you see the universe crying out for a designer. When you look at the microscopes and you look inward, you can see the cell crying out for a creator. You can see that. Ladies and gentlemen, people who believe in God, we believe that we were created in God's image. The Bible says we were created in God's image. Now, what's interesting about that is the way the Bible describes the way you and I were made does not necessarily depict this sort of assembly line kind of construction, that here's a blueprint for human beings, and we're going to vary it a little bit and start pumping them out of the factory, off to the assembly line. Like, here's this model, and here's this model. In a sort of cold and calculating way. It's interesting the way the Bible actually describes how you and I were made. Not just in this, yes, God's an engineer kind of a way, but in a way that God is an artist, and he's an intimate one at that. Think about what Psalm 139 actually says. Psalm 139 in verses 13 to 14 says, "For you formed me in my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Knitted. That word isn't accidental. That's a statement, not just about the fact that you were designed, but you were designed specifically. Not that humanity was designed, but you were designed specifically. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I got a lot of sweaters. I live in Michigan. I had to have a lot of sweaters. And they're all very nice, and they're all very warm, and they're all very similar. They look like they came off out of a factory. There was a template, and they were made. And I like those sweaters. But I have one particular sweater at my house that is more valuable than any sweater I own. And it won't even fit on this hand. It's the sweater my mother knit for me to bring me home from the hospital when I was born. It's the same sweater I brought every one of my children home in the hospital from. You know why that's valuable to me? Because it's designed, it had a blueprint, but when my mother made it, whenever she did every cross, stitch, loop, whatever it is you guys do when you knit, whenever she was doing that, Abdu, Abdu, Abdu. Every one of those. Thinking the legacy of my own children. She thought of me. You were knit together in your mother's womb. How do I know this? When we finally unraveled and finally decoded the human genome, the human DNA, Francis Collins, who is a believer, he's a scientist, he's now the head of the National Institutes of Health, not an intellectual lightweight, by the way. Him and his team finally had mapped out the human genome, and they found out that it was 3.1 billion, with a B, bits of information long. This is what he says in his book, The Language of God. This newly revealed text was 3 billion letters long and written in a strange and cryptographic four-letter code. Such is the amazing complexity of the information carried within each cell of the human body. And by the way, you have trillions of those. That a live reading of that code at a rate of 3 letters per second would take 31 years, even if reading continued day and night. Printing these letters out in regular font size on normal bound paper and binding them all together would result in a tower the height of the Washington Monument. For the first time on that summer morning, this amazing script, carrying within it all the instruction for building a human being, was available to the world. One strand of DNA in your body, in the trillions of cells you have in your body, if you were to print out the code for one strand of DNA, the stack would be as tall as the Washington Monument. That's just for you. And there are 7 billion of us. Where do we see language? Do we see language happen by chance? No, whenever we detect language, we detect intelligence. We see it. Why do you think the SETI, the S-E-T-I, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, looks for or irregular patterns in the radio waves of the universe? Not because those things are signals of randomness, because they're the search for intelligence. If we see an irregular pattern, we say that might be intelligence. That's what DNA is, 3.1 billion bits of it. Francis Collins was at Johns Hopkins University, one of our leading universities in this country, giving a talk on what it means to be human. And he showed this. This is an incredible, can we dim the lights a little bit? Because we got to see the, or a lot. No, I'm kidding. They told me that was going to happen. This is a picture, he showed this, of the rose window of the York Minster Cathedral. It's gorgeous. That's beautiful. That's artistry. And then he showed this. That is DNA. That was the same reaction they had. That's a cross-section of the DNA helix looking down into it. Artistry, beauty, the knitting together of a human being. You know what he did in response, my understanding is? Lights back up. He picked up his guitar and worshiped. You were knit together in your mother's womb. Francis Crick, one of the sort of discoverers of the genome, not of the genome, sorry, of the structure of DNA, he said an honest man, himself a confirmed atheist, he said an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense, the origin of life, this, appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many other conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. You look outwardly to the heavens to see the design of the universe for life. You look inwardly through the telescopes to see the design of humanity and that knitting together. And I do believe, ladies and gentlemen, there's one more thing about our existence. You look Godwardly to see purpose and morality. God makes sense of objective morality and human dignity. Now, what I hope we can all agree on, everybody who's watching or listening, wherever you might be, I hope we can agree on something, that human beings have essential worth. We have dignity and value in and of ourselves, that every human being is worthy of our respect and dignity. I think everyone agrees with that. I don't care if you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever it might be. I hope you can agree with that. Unfortunately, I think that human beings are bad at keeping this consistent. All we need to do is look at the news to find that out. In fact, I think 24-hour news is one of the worst inventions of humanity in the past century. But I'll tell you one thing. One thing good about it is it does tell you that when the Bible says human beings are depraved, all you need is to turn on the television any time of the day and you'll find that out for sure. But the fact of the matter is, we all have a sense of human value and human dignity, that there is some moral purpose for our existence. When you look at secular humanism, for example, secular humanism is sort of the worldview face of atheism. You can see that the central question in secular humanism is how do we understand the value of humanity? That's the humanism part. Human beings are essentially valuable and essentially worthwhile, and we are sort of the masters of creation and all these kind of things. But secular, we don't need God to tell us that. So humanism, human beings are valuable, but with secular, we don't need God to exist for that to be true. That's the struggle. But on an objective sense, human beings have value. Almost everyone believes this. What do I mean by objective? What do I mean by that is that it is true independent of your belief of it. In other words, circles don't have corners, whether you think they do or don't. They just don't. By definition, circles don't have corners. There are certain objective realities of life that don't depend on your opinion. That's objective. So to say that human beings have inherent value and dignity, irrespective of human opinion, means there's an objective standard, there's some objective basis to say that. But if human beings are all there is, and there's no higher intelligence than us in terms of, I don't mean aliens, I mean like a sort of transcendent intelligence, and we are the measure of all things, as Protagoras once said, then the problem is it does depend on human opinion because we're the last game in town. And you know what history tells us over and over again? We're bad at this. From Pol Pot to Mao Zedong to the conquests, through the Roman Empire, through all these things, we can see that human beings do not value each other in an objective way. We just don't. Richard Dawkins, once again, in his book River Out of Eden, he sort of confirms this about the purposelessness of humanity. He says, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. Such a universe would be neither evil nor good in intention. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Do you see what he's saying? Here's the question. If there's no God, how is he wrong? No evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Joel Marx, longtime professor emeritus of philosophy at University of New Haven. Now, Joel Marx is interesting because Joel Marx used to be an ethicist. I think he still is an ethicist, but he's changed his mind on some things. He's an atheist, you see. And he wrote a lot of columns trying to justify objective morality, that moral values exist even if there is no God. He spent a lot of time trying to do this. And then he said he had what he called his reverse epiphany, that in fact there is no morality because there is no God. He says, the long and the short of it is that I became convinced that atheism implies amorality or amorality. And that since I'm an atheist, I must therefore embrace amorality. I experienced my shocking epiphany that the religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality, but they are incorrect, I still believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality. Now, he's not saying be a bad guy and go start raping and killing out in the streets every 5 seconds. He's not saying that. He has sort of this social contract theory where we just don't want to eat each other, so we invent these rules. But that's not a moral characteristic, that's a survival characteristic. That's just to keep us from killing each other. But it's not moral. Can that really be the case? Does anyone in this room really think that's the case, that there is no real morality? I think everyone here does think that. I think you do think that. And the question is, what makes sense of that? A mindless universe, a blind, pitiless universe that does not care, of meaningless good fortune and meaningless tragedies, or a universe that science seems to be suggesting to us was created on purpose, for the purpose of you being here, and that you were created for a particular purpose as well. That sense of morality, God makes sense of that morality, of our sense of equality, of the things that we all care about. Everyone in this room, I hope, believes that all human beings are created equal, or at least exist in a state of equality. But if the physical is all there is, if all there is the physical, or all there is the material, or naturalism, then how in fact is that true? How is that true? I'm probably bigger than everyone in this room. I used to do full contact fighting. I know how to take care of myself. I was a college-level athlete. I'm relatively fast. My guess is that if we had to compete for food in this room, I could take you. So we're not physically equal, but maybe you're smarter than I am. Maybe you can get a couple of buddies together and devise a way to get the food before I do, or to trap me, or to overpower me as a group together. Maybe that ingenuity, you have a higher ingenuity than I do. We're not all mentally equal either. So what is this fiction we create about equality? If there's no God, if there's no transcendent source of equality, what is this fiction we're creating? This isn't all pie in the sky or theoretical, ladies and gentlemen. Peter Singer is a philosopher and an ethicist out of Princeton University, and he says that human beings don't have value just because they're born. He advocates the killing, not advocates, but he justifies the killing of newborn babies because they don't have value in and of themselves unless the parents give them that value. And Francesca Giubellini and Alberto Minerva out of Australia are making the same argument in medical journals. These things have consequences. But you know what's funny? When you look at the Bible, and you look at the story in John chapter 4 of Jesus and the woman at the well, you see this sense of equality. You see something that's beyond the physical. What does Jesus do? He goes through to Samaria, and he's at Jacob's well. There he is at the well, and he's alone now because his disciples have gone off, and a woman approaches. She's alone. He's a Samaritan woman. He's in Samaria. Now, there's an enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. There's this hostility that exists there because Samaritans are a half-breed. They're genetically sort of inferior, so to speak, and Jews and Samaritans are politically at odds as well, and they're religiously at odds. All kind of animosity between the two, and they look down on each other, and they don't have any real good relationship. And in fact, John is careful to point that out, that when Jesus speaks to her and he initiates the conversation, the woman is so shocked, she says, "How can you, a Jew, speak to me, a Samaritan?" And he puts in parentheses, they didn't have them back then, but we put them in parentheses, "For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans." She's shocked at his engagement with her. And he begins to engage with her, and he sees her brokenness. She comes to the well alone, which tells him a million things about her life, because you don't go to wells by yourself. You went in groups of women for friendship and community, but also for safety. Yet here she is by herself. She's a half-breed who's also rejected by her own community. And she's got moral failings left and right, and political chips on her shoulder, and all these things. And he unmasks her piece by piece. You know what he tells her? He doesn't say, "Become like me, become a Jew, do all these things," or "Sorry, you're lost because you're not like us." He doesn't do that. As he unmasks her, he says, "The Father seeks those who worship him in spirit and in truth, because God is spirit." Her imago Dei, the image of God put on her, is what makes her a child of God, which makes her equal to everyone else. He does not shun her or forsake her like the society did. He included her because he saw in her the imprint of what his Father had done in making her, that she was knit together in her mother's womb. And he invites her. That's real equality. That's where it comes from. In fact, when you look at some of the great histories of the world, when you look at the way the Roman Empire, for example, you know that this word person, this comes from a Latin word, persona? It's sort of akin to the word mask. It's something that's put on you by someone else. So in the early days of the Roman Empire, you weren't given personhood just because you were born. You either had to be born into a certain status or have certain kind of property or be a soldier or do whatever it was. You had to sort of earn it, or the government had to give personhood status to you. It didn't exist by virtue of your birth. When Christians began to preach the gospel, because of the advent of the cross, that started to change. Started to erode away this fabric of inequality. We began to see people as equal because Christ's cross says this: we are all equally sinners, but we're all equally redeemable. Equality was there. And so Christians began to spread and help not just other Christians, but even people who weren't Christians. They were helping them and feeding the poor and taking care of the plague infected. They were doing that themselves. In fact, the Emperor Julian lamented, and he said, the insipid Galileans are having a foothold now because they're taking care not of their own only, but also for us. Because they saw all as equal. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Twain once said that history does not repeat, but it sure does rhyme. He's right about that. Because Christians were helping those, at great peril to themselves, by the way, helping those who weren't amongst the Christians. Where do you find people rushing in to Ebola-infected Africa, rushing in to places where refugees need help and building the hospitals? Sure, there are secular organizations that do this as well, but Christians are the progenitors of this stuff. We're the ones who have been going in there. Now, that's not to say that you can't do this if you're not a Christian. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that the impetus is there to help those who don't look or act like you, because Christ helped those who didn't look or act like him at all. Equality is there. We bear God's image, we bear the divine imprint and the fingerprint, and that is the seat and the root of all value. With the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus are the ground for trust in the God of the Bible. Now, I've talked about God in general, the design of the universe, the design of DNA, the existence of morality. These all depend on God's existence. But which God exactly are we talking about? There's a huge menu to choose from, isn't there? A huge menu. So why pick the God of the Bible? Why pick the God of the Christians? Because there is a unique fact, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, that says that he is the one in whom we can place our trust. Paul the Apostle says it specifically. Specifically says that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if Christ is not raised, then the dead are not raised. And if the dead are not raised, then you are still dead in your sins. And you are of all people to be most pitied. In other words, chuck it. If he's still dead, chuck it. It's not worth it. He's right. That's Paul. He's saying, yes, if we can falsify this belief, then don't believe it. That's refreshing. So unique. It's a test we can put him to. The reality of the resurrection is this. Ladies and gentlemen, I spent a lot of years as a trial lawyer, so I'm going to give you sort of a closing statement on how I would describe the resurrection of Jesus as a historical fact. I'm going to give you 4 facts, go through them relatively quickly, and then I'm going to close with an illustration about why I think Christianity is not delusional. It's worthy of your reverence and your respect, and worth considering. Here are 4 facts, 3 of which nearly every scholar, whether they're atheist, agnostic, Christian, whatever it might be, who studies the historical Jesus agrees actually happened, and the 4th one, an impressive number of them, even skeptics agree about the history of Jesus. So there's 4 facts, and any theory worth its salt about what happened to Jesus has to account for all 4, or at least the first 3 of these facts. If you can't account for all 4, then your theory isn't broad enough to encompass the entire set of data. If it doesn't give them enough weight, then it doesn't have explanatory power. So a good theory accounts for all these facts and gives you the story in a way that sounds compelling, or it seems compelling intellectually. So here's what it is. The 4 facts. I put them in an acronym, CASE, C-A-S-E. I don't have slides for this, I don't think, so I'm just going to write it down. C-A-S-E, the case for the resurrection of Jesus. The first fact is death by crucifixion, that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate. In fact, we know this with such certainty that John Dominic Crossan himself, not a conservative Christian who doesn't believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus, actually says that Jesus died on the cross is as historical a fact as any ever can be. Now, why do I point this out? Isn't this obvious? No, because there are 1.5 billion people, they're called Muslims, who don't believe this fact. But the scholarship, the history says, yes, he was on that cross, and yes, he did in fact die. That's the C in the case. The A is the appearances to the disciples. The disciples of Jesus claimed to have seen him risen from the dead, that he appeared to them having risen from the dead. Does that prove anything in and of itself? No, of course not. But they firmly believed not that he survived the cross, but that he rose from the dead after having been killed there. Now, why is that important? Because we have multiple witnesses. You have the disciples themselves. You have, as Paul reports, 500 people. The women are the first to see him risen from the dead. And of course, everyone is converted from skepticism or from a state of despair and hopelessness into lions for the faith, every one of them. Why is that important? See, they didn't believe something because someone else convinced them it was true, and it could have been a lie, sort of like Nazism, or that Hail Bop thing that happened a number of years ago. Some of you guys are too young to know what this is, but there was a cult out of California, I believe it was, who believed that the Hail Bop comet, when it came by, was preceding a spaceship that was going to take them up to like a celestial heaven, and they all killed themselves believing that. Now, they were convinced by somebody else that it was true, but they didn't claim to see it with their own eyes. The disciples of Jesus claimed, I saw him with my own eyes risen from the dead. And every one of them was willing to, or did in fact go to torture or death or exile, believing it. Why would they do that if it was false? Wouldn't one of them say, whoa, 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 put the knife down, not true. We made it up? Not one of them did that. In fact, so strong is that Paula Fredrickson, a historian at Boston University, said, and she's not a Christian, she said, look, I'm going to paraphrase. She said, look, they saw something. I don't know what it was they did see, but all the evidence we have points to the fact they must have seen something that convinced them Christ was risen from the dead. Even Gerhard Ludemann, who is an atheist, says that they saw something that convinced them Christ was risen from the dead. So the C is the crucifixion, the A is the appearances to the disciples, the S is the skeptics converted, Paul and James. The Bible tells us that James thought his half-brother was a kook, and that Paul was a persecutor. Paul tells us this over and over again. We have no reason to doubt this, that Paul himself was a persecutor of the church. Yet both of them converted suddenly. James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church, and Paul becomes the champion of the Gentiles of the gospel, all because they said they saw Christ risen from the dead. Now look, ladies and gentlemen, I've been in a lot of trials before, and a lot of cases and different litigations. It's very rare when someone who is against you and who thinks you're nuts suddenly takes your side. It's very rare. When you have that kind of a witness, you put him on the stand and you let him sing his song all day to the jury because there's an air of credibility. Why did he do that? Because there's a reason. There's something behind that. In fact, we have whole exceptions to all the evidence rules that keep that kind of testimony out. We let it in because of the credibility of it. We have that in James and Paul, the skeptics having converted. And then the fourth fact, which again, not everybody agrees on, but an impressive number do, is the E, the empty tomb. The tomb was known, and it was empty 3 days later. They knew which tomb it was. William Lane Craig makes a very nice argument about how they knew which tomb it was because they mentioned whose it was, Joseph of Arimathea. Now, he was a Sanhedrist. He was a member of that Jewish high council, and he was relatively known. If you were going to make up a tomb, wouldn't you say it was in Bob's tomb? You know, that guy, the guy. Who? The guy. So they couldn't falsify it. But they specifically named who it was, and it wasn't just some guy, it was a prominent guy. So they kind of knew where the tomb was. And then 3 days later, it was empty. In fact, we see the stories being invented to explain why it was empty in the first place, like they stole the body or whatever it was, or they got the wrong tomb. But all that presupposes that the tomb itself was empty. And who do you see finding the tomb empty first? Women. Why is that important? Because in first century Palestine, women's testimony was basically worthless. So if you were going to make up a story about the risen Christ, who would be the first people to see Jesus risen from the dead? Peter, or John, or one of these big boys, right? One of the men and one of the staunch followers of Jesus, they're the first ones to see it. That's not what the gospel writers actually say. They say the women were the first ones to see it because they're the ones who came to care for Jesus. The men were off hiding somewhere. If you were going to make up a story, wouldn't it be a little bit more flattering to you but they didn't make up a story. They were telling it like it was. So the resurrection of Jesus as a matter of history, all four facts are accounted for. The crucifixion, the appearances, the skeptics converted, and the empty tomb are all accounted for if Jesus rose from the dead. And no other theory can really come close to explaining what happened in the first century. It's solid. It's solid evidence. People ask me, why do I trust the Bible or trust Jesus? Well, he died and rose from the dead. And the guys who rise from the dead have credibility. Don't trust me. Don't put your faith in me. Put your faith in him. Because he showed that he was the master of life and death. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring this to a close with an illustration about a life-shaping moment. A number of years ago, I got a phone call from a friend who's a classmate in school of mine. And this friend was an agnostic, really an atheist in school. He didn't really believe in God. I was a Muslim back then when we were together in school, and he knew that. And we had some discussions about religious matters and matters of ultimate reality and these kind of things. But we never got into it in very serious ways until after I became a Christian. See, he was invited to my wedding. He came to my wedding. He saw that I was a Christian. It was obvious. It was in a church, and I was saying and doing Christian-y things. So he saw this, and then he went back to another state where he was working, and he called me up later. He was going to do some business in Michigan. And he said, hey, I'm going to be in Michigan. I'm going to be in the Detroit area. Can we have dinner together? I said, sure. If you pay, I'll pray. And he said, okay, fine. We'll do that. So we got together, had a very nice dinner. We started, we were waxing on about family and friends and career and all these things. But as the night went on, and the staff started to get more sparse, and the patrons started to go away, and the night became later and later, and our coffee got colder and colder, we began to talk about matters of spirituality. And he said, so I gotta know, what happened to you? How did you become this Christian guy? You wrote a book. At that time, it was only one book. I have 2 books out now. And you started a ministry. What in the world is going on here? So I began to explain to him the evidences and the reasons why I became a Christian, what I thought was the veracity of the Bible, and all these things, the evidence I gave for you for the resurrection and all this. We went into all that. And he says, look, I have a hard time believing, though, that this God you're claiming who's good and all-powerful exists, that there's so much of suffering and evil in the world. That's a tough one for me to get my mind around. Of course, everyone in this room has asked that question. You're a strong believer. You've still asked, how could this be? How could this God who is all-powerful and all good exist if there's so much suffering in the world? And my friend said, if he's all good, he would want to stop suffering. If he was all-powerful, he could stop suffering, yet he didn't stop suffering. So either he's not all good, or he's not all-powerful, or he just is a figment of your imagination. He's a delusion. Tough question, right? It's the question that everyone struggles with. Now, interestingly enough, this has been answered for a long time. There's numerous answers. There's numerous ways to answer this question. We don't have an embarrassment of lack of answers. We have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to answers. So I went on and gave him some of these answers. And I won't share with you all of them because time doesn't permit. But one of them I centered on towards the end was this. I said, look, if God exists, isn't it possible that he sees all things, both past, present, and future, both future actual and future possible events? So he knows what will happen and what would have happened if certain things had happened. He said, well, I don't know about that. We hashed about it for a while. I said, okay, sure. If God exists, especially the God you're talking about, then yes, he would know all future possible events and actual events. I said, good. So isn't it at least possible that God could allow some suffering to exist for a moment in time, or for some, even a large event, and he allows it to happen, doesn't create it, but allows it to happen for some greater possible good that you and I can't see? Maybe 5 minutes from now or 50,000 years from now. Isn't that at least possible? And he said, no. I said, wait a minute, it's not possible? He's like, no, how could that tsunami that happened, in the Indian Ocean in 2004 possibly result in a greater possible good? I'm like, well, if you claim that it couldn't possibly happen, then you know all the future. Congratulations, you're God. He got the point that, okay, look, I know that I can't know all possible future things, so yes, it's at least philosophically or logically possible that God could allow suffering for a greater possible good. And then the conversation changed. You see, at this point, ladies and gentlemen, it was just philosophical. It was just a couple of friends talking, no theory. But then it changed because the philosophical road met the existential rubber. It wasn't just syllogisms and arguments. He looked up from his coffee with a decidedly different look in his eyes. You do that? He said to me, why should I believe that this God is good and values me or my mother when he let her die of cancer when I was 10? It's the same question, just asked a little differently. Do you give him some syllogisms then? Do you rattle off these theodicies and these answers to these things in a philosophical way? Not in a cold, calculated sort of way. You got to understand what's going on. And what do? Well, you do what I do. You pray really quickly for something. And you swallow hard, and you rely on, what you've studied, but also God to give utterance at this particular moment. And here's what came out of my mouth. I said, I can't even possibly imagine what that's like to lose someone so valuable to me at such a young age. I've lost loved ones, and I've suffered my share of tragedies and losses in my life, but never that one. I have no idea what that's like. I really don't. I can't tell you that I know what your pain is like. I can't even fathom that. But we've been talking now for some time about this idea that God could allow suffering for some greater possible good, and you agreed. You said, yeah. Said, that's a nice theory. It's a nice philosophical idea, sure. But anybody who believes in any kind of a God could tell you that. A theist, someone who's a theist could just tell you that. A Muslim could tell you that. Sort of a biblical Jew or a rabbinic Jew could tell you that. Someone who believes in God, who's Jewish, could tell you that God could allow suffering. The Lord works in mysterious ways kind of a thing. We can tell you that. People who belong to the largest religion in the world, good personism. People who are good go to heaven. Everyone belongs to that one, right? They could tell you the same thing. God could allow suffering for some greater possible good. Can I tell you, though, a unique thing about Christianity? I don't have a nice little theory that I hope might be true. I have history on my side. You see, God allowed a horrible evil to be exhibited on his own son. An unjust death at the hands of ugly sinners, not for some greater possible good that might happen in the future, possibly if we think about it hard enough, but for the greatest possible good there could be, the salvation of the entire world. I don't have theory. I have history. It tells me not only that God could do it, but he actually did do it. His death on the cross and his resurrection from the grave gives me confidence. You see, atheism didn't provide my friend, who called that death a life-shaping moment. Atheism didn't provide him with any answers. He had been struggling with it by that point for up to 28 or 29 years. That's why he asked me the question, because he couldn't find an answer in all those years. What does atheism tell you? Tough? Oh well? Buck up? Dawkins says it's a meaningless tragedy. Meaningless, unless you give it some meaning yourself, in which case maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Julian Baggini pointed this out. He's an atheist. By the way, relatively, straightforward on some of these things. In his piece, I think it was called something like, yes, life without God can be bleak. Here's what he writes. Atheists have to live with the knowledge that there is no salvation, no redemption, no second chances. Lives can go terribly wrong in ways that can never be put right. Now, what's interesting is that in the United Kingdom, there was this billboard campaign that the Humanist Association put on, to put these billboards on the side of these buses, these double-decker buses, and it said, there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. This is what Baggini says. This is what an atheist says. He says, can you really tell the parents who lost their child to a suicide after years of depression that they should just stop worrying and enjoy their life? My friend needed hope. He needed something for the life-shaping moment. When I offered him that, it began to spark something. But he asked me a second question. Did you hear it? He said, how can I know that this God is good and this God values me or my mother when he let her die that young? I asked him for the follow-up question. I said, how do you know anything is valuable? How do you know? I've got a lot of things in my house that are very valuable to me. I have the DVD of my wedding. I have video and photos of my kids' first steps and their first birthdays and all these things, and they're all precious to me. Precious. But if there's a fire in my house, you better believe I'm getting my kids and my wife, and we're out of there. And those things will burn, and I'll mourn the destruction of those things. But I'm not going to risk my life for DVDs and photo prints. But if you let one of my kids be in that room, in that house, you better believe it. I will sacrifice everything to save them. I value them that much. You know how valuable something is by how much you're willing to pay for it. And I told my friend, you and your mother have an immeasurable value in Christianity because the immeasurable God paid an immeasurable price to spend an immeasurable eternity with you. He offered that to your mother, and he offers that to you today. Not that I hope it's true, but I know it's true based on what he already has done. He's paid that price. If you're not a Christian and you're here today, I don't know why you're here. I have no idea. No idea. But there's a question in your mind about purpose and about value. Are you here on purpose? I think the universe cries out that you were created on purpose. The universe was created for the purpose of you being here. Your DNA is the evidence that you were knit together from your mother's womb so that you specifically could be here, and that Christ's cross says that you will have an eternity vouchsafed by Jesus' work. Real humanism is Christian humanism, the idea that human beings have value. The cross is that statement that human beings have value. If you're a believer in Christ today, you bask in the knowledge of this last stanza of Amazing Grace. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. The eternal joy of that. If you're not a Christian, that's offered to you. 10,000 years bright shining as the sun, where you'll have no less days to sing God's praise than when you'd first begun. I invite you to know him, to explore him, to ask him your tough questions. I asked him, and he gave me. I'm certain he will give you those answers as well. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. God bless you, ladies and gentlemen.